Hello BookTube. Today on my 2023 library tour, I am continuing with the history wall. This particular episode will be covering the bottom shelf of this big but kind of squat, mid-sized bookcase that I have another bookcase on top of. So let's get going. So first up is Lakota America, A New History of Indigenous Power by Pekka Hamalainen. This is a history of the Lakota peoples from the mid 17th century through to the near present. And it features some interesting and I think unique arguments about Lakota society and relations with not only other Native peoples, but also with the U.S. government and white settlers, which I don't think many other Native American scholars, and particularly Lakota scholars, agree with. I had two goes at this book last year. The first one was a Bale. The second one was a Bale Redemption, but I'm not entirely sure what I make of it, honestly. Probably need to pick up some more works on Native American history. Okay. There. Next is This Vast Southern Empire, Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy by Matthew Karp. This is a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it, reading it. It's largely why I picked this up. It basically looks at how Southern politicians controlled U.S. foreign policy, and also in general they controlled the government in the years leading up to the Civil War, and how they sort of try to protect and expand slavery throughout the Americas, trying to annex Cuba, relations with Brazil, the filibustering others. So yeah, but it's a fascinating book. I really ought to have another go at it at some point. Next is the amazing The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Chinese Cultural Revolution by Yang Jixing, translated by Stacy Mosher and Guo Jian. This is a fantastic look at the Chinese Cultural Revolution, at the politics behind it, the politics between the competing factions of the Communist Party, the abuses that were committed by all sides. It's a harrowing, engrossing history of the Cultural Revolution. Next is If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future by Jill Lepore. This book is a microhistory that explores the Simulmatics Corporation. It was a corporation that claimed to be able to, using data, like collected data, to predict outcomes, sort of prefiguring the algorithm. It's a fascinating book, and I rather enjoyed it. Next is the phenomenal A World Beneath the Sands, The Golden Age of Egyptology by Toby Wilkinson. This is a history of Egyptology and Egypt in general, from the late 18th century through to 1922 and the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. I love this book immensely. Next is another great book, Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings by Neil Price. Really fascinating book. has some very interesting arguments about the Vikings, if I remember. It's been a few years since I've read it, though. This is The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty by Ray Takei. This is an interesting look at the reign of the Pahlavi Dynasty, particularly the last Shah, as well as the Iranian Revolution. Next is Magic, A History from Alchemy to Witchcraft, from the Ice Age to the Present by Chris Gosden. This is... I don't know what I make of this book. This was a Bell Redemption, if I recall correctly. There's quite a bit of woo-woo that I think hampers the book. It's also uneven. The sections about prehistory and the Eurasian steppe are fantastic. The parts on Europe are really good. But if you're interested in East Asia, Africa, the Americas, you're going to be disappointed, bitterly disappointed. And yeah, so there's that. I mean, I do have a sweet tooth for magic history. I mean, I am my favorite genre of fiction is fantasy, and also want to write fantasy. So I have a bit of I've developed an interest in the history of magic. So anyway, but I wish that one was better. Because the studies of magic and the history of magic is unfortunately hampered, of course, by the fact that there's that folklore, urban legend style that writers are so often tempted to that can kind of wreck a book because critical analysis goes out the window. But anyway, next is The Crown and Crisis, Countdown to the Abdication by Alexander Larman. This is a really good look at Edward VIII, the lead up to the abdication and the abdication crisis. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, great book, or good book at least. Next is Square Haunting, 5 Writers in London Between the Wars by Francesca Wade. This is a group biography of 5 writers. And they are, because I can remember 3 of the 5. I can't remember 2 of them. So the 5 are H.D., Dorothy L. Sayers, Jane Ellen Harrison, Eileen Power, and Virginia Woolf, who all lived in this one neighborhood of London between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second. Not consecutively, not like at the same time, but at different periods. And so the book looks at their lives while they were living in the square. I thought it was uneven. To be honest, I don't think I was all that fond of this book, really. I read it for the BookTube prize in 2021, and I think this was the top of the particular grouping, largely because the others sucked. But anyway, and next is Revolt in the Netherlands, The 80 Years' War by 1568 to 1648 by Anton van der Lim, translated by Andy Brown. So this is a history of the Dutch War of Independence, and it is incredibly dry, and I did bail on it. Next is Raised to Rule, Educating Royalty at the Court of the Spanish Habsburg, 1601 to 1634, by Martha K. Hoffman. This is a really fascinating look at the education of several generations of, well, at least one generation of Spanish royal children. I really enjoyed it, despite the fact that it is rather dry. Going back to books that I build on, this is The Water Kingdom, A Secret History of China by Philip Ball. Philip Ball is a prolific writer of mostly popular science or science-related topics, and from what I can gather, this is a history that really focuses more on the technology of Imperial China. And I really did not get on with this book at all. Its writing is rather dry and just, I could not get into it. But I really did enjoy this next book, The History of Bhutan by Karma Phuntsho. This is a fantastic look at the Kingdom of Bhutan. It's really fascinating. I really enjoyed this book. Next is The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness, 1680 to 1790 by Richie Robertson. So this is an intellectual history of the Enlightenment. It largely looks at the Enlighteners and their various debates during this 110-year period and a little bit before. This was one of the books I selected for my Mammoth Heavy March TBR, which ended up not doing as well as I'd hoped. It was a complete and utter disaster, much like February Fantasy Stories. And while I had hoped that history would steer me right, given that the first three books were either classics or literary fiction, no such luck. And I will talk a lot more about this this coming weekly reads because I do have thoughts. Next is an interesting book. This is The Chinese in America by Iris Cheng. So this book looks at Chinese immigration to the United States from the 19th century into the 20th century, and it is fascinating. I really enjoyed this book. Next is a book that I have not gotten around to yet, and that is She-Wolves, The Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth by Helen Castor. The next book I have on here is one that I have a bit of unfinished business with, and that is Cleopatra the Great, The Woman Behind the Legend by Joanne Fletcher. So this is a biography of Cleopatra, and I ended up bailing on it when I had to go at this book last year, and I probably do need to give this a bail redemption at some point. Next is a book that I have not yet read, and probably would be a candidate for another March of the Mammoths because it is a mammoth book. This is American Empire, A Global History by A.G. Hopkins. Ooh, is that a big book? Next is one of my favorite books from 2021, and that is The Age of Decadence, A History of Britain, 1880 to 1914 by Simon Heffer. This is a magnificent book. Like I said with Big Wonderful Thing, this is history as it should be written. This book is phenomenal. Just absolutely phenomenal. I think it was my top book from 2021. And finally, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. This is a look at racism and racial politics in the U.S. Through basically tourism. Clint Smith goes to a number of locations in both the United States and in Africa, and really looks at how these places played a role in the international slave trade, plantation slavery, and 20th century racial injustice. And I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. It was, again, one of my top books of 2021. So that wraps up this last shelf. Tomorrow I will be moving on to the next bookcase, which will take about the rest of the week and the beginning of next week. So anyway, BookTube, I will be back in a few minutes with a tag video. So until then, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.